Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the assassination of African American leaders during the decade of the 1960s. And we have with us to talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the assassination of African American leaders, Dr. LBaldwin, who has been with us on a number of occasions. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, let me welcome you to the show this morning.
Thank you.
And I'm sure that you need, and I say this every time, no introduction because you've been with us from the very, very beginning. But I think that each time, Dr. Baldwin, you bring some additional insights into some of the things that we're talking about. And I think that since this year represents the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we've had an opportunity to celebrate that. But at the same time, I don't think that we've had an opportunity to pull in this aspect of what we're talking about, and which is to say the assassination of African American leaders at this time, and perhaps the impact that this had in helping to bring about those assassinations. Let's talk about that, but let's talk about LBaldwin. And more specifically, what we'd like for you to do is to talk about some of the work that you've done dealing with civil rights and Martin Luther King and that kind of information during the first segment, and then we'll talk about the assassination and et cetera after this first segment.
I should begin by saying that since 1984, it's been about, what now, 30 years since I actually started to do research on Dr. King and the civil rights movement. And since that time, I've been involved with 11 publications, books on Dr. King. I've authored 5. I've edited a couple of books and have been, of course, a co-author or a co-editor of 5 other books. So I've been involved in this kind of scholarship for more than 30 years. And I've been very interested not only in Dr. King's contributions to the civil rights movement, but also contributions of Thurgood Marshall, others who were involved in litigation, the court system, because I think the civil rights movement was fought on a number of different fronts, not simply the social activism of Dr. King and the SCLC, but also people like Thurgood Marshall, who was a part of the Supreme Court, and people like Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was involved in politics. So I think we have to understand that the civil rights movement was fought on several different fronts. And my scholarship has really been about that kind of thing, how the movement unfolded on several different fronts.
Very good. Now, in terms of the topic that we're going to deal with today, the Civil Rights Act, let's talk about the Civil Rights Act from the perspective of what was the situation prior to 1964 in terms of what you might describe as civil rights.
Exactly. When you look at the period prior to 1964, we have to take into account deeply entrenched patterns of Jim Crow in the South. Now we know that going back to 1866, you get your first Civil Rights Act. And that Civil Rights Act, of course, was actually about establishing the citizenship, not only of whites, but of other minorities, of minorities in society. In 1875, you get your second Civil Rights Act, which actually is the first Civil Rights Act that dealt with public accommodations, that blacks should be treated fairly in inns and on public conveyances, on water and on land and eateries. 1957, you get your third Civil Rights Act, which creates a Civil Rights Commission. And in 1960, you get a fourth Civil Rights Act. But the most comprehensive one was the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which, of course, prohibited discrimination in employment, which meant that labor unions and employers had to hire and fire people without references to race or color. And that 1964 Civil Rights Act also had a lot to do with education. It meant that there would be federal oversight to make sure that discrimination did not occur in schools, that voting rights would be extended without literacy tests and poll taxes, that public facilities like swimming pools.
And Dr. Ball, let us take this first commercial break, and then we'll get back to where you are now. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.